Hello, friends. Happy Thursday. Happy St. George's Day as well. Thanks, St. George, for killing that dragon. That's a weight off. Thanks also to Shakespeare for being born and dying on the same day. Speaking of Shakespeare, here's what I think I might do once I finish this, which I'll finish tomorrow. The complete works of Shakespeare. I think I'm going to, I think if I'm going to continue this at all, I'm going to just go into the complete works of Shakespeare, which is less related to the plague, but also might be quite fun and also more popular. So yeah, listen, no one can stop me. We're all in lockdown. We continue then with the penultimate chapter of this, in which I was a little confused because this is a fictional narrator, and I was trying to work out, as it was published in 1722, if this was a 100-year-old man basically recalling his adulthood during the plague. And then, because of a note here, I realised that actually this is supposed to be the publication of a long missing manuscript, because there is a note that says the author of this journal, the fictional author, was in fact buried in one of the plague pits he mentions. So that solves that. The plague pit, in fact, I think is one that is, or was indeed, currently being dug up just outside Liverpool Street Station to put in the Crossrail link, the old site of Bethlehem, or as it was also known, Bedlam. So, yeah, there's lots of stuff about plague pits here. You've got that to look forward to. Enjoy. But the mercy of God was greater to the rest than we had reason to expect. For the malignity, as I have said, of the distemper was spent. The contagion was exhausted, and also the winter weather came on apace, and the air was clear and cold, with sharp frosts, and this increasing still, most of those that had fallen sick recovered, and the health of the city began to return. There were indeed some returns of the distemper even in the month of December, and the bills increased near 100, but it went off again, and so in a short while things began to return to their own channel. And wonderful it was to see how populous the city was again all on a sudden, so that a stranger could not miss the numbers that were lost. Neither was there any miss of the inhabitants as to their dwellings. Few or no empty houses were to be seen, or if there were some, there was no want of tenants for them. I wish I could say that as the city had a new face, so the manners of the people had a new appearance. I doubt not, but there were many that retained a sincere sense of their deliverance, and were that heartily thankful to that sovereign hand that had protected them in so dangerous a time. It would be very uncharitable to judge otherwise in a city so populous, and where the people were so devout as they were here in the time of the visitation itself. But, except what of this was to be found in particular families and faces, it must be acknowledged that the general practice of the people was just as it was before. Very little difference was to be seen. Some indeed said things were worse, that the morals of the people declined from this very time, that the people, hardened by the danger they had been in, like seamen after a storm is over, were more wicked and more stupid, more bold and hardened in their vices and immoralities than they were before. But I will not carry it so far neither. It would take up a history of no small length to give a particular of all the gradations by which the course of things in this city came to be restored again, and to run in their own channel as they did before. Some parts of England were now infected as violently as London had been. The cities of Norwich, Peterborough, Lincoln, Colchester, and other places were now visited, and the magistrates of London began to set rules for our conduct as to corresponding with those cities. It is true we could not pretend to forbid their people coming to London, because it was impossible to know them asunder. So, after many consultations, the Lord Mayor and Court of Aldermen were obliged to drop it. All they could do was to warn and caution the people not to entertain in their houses or converse with any people who they knew came from such infected places. But they might as well have talked to the air, for the people of London thought themselves so plague-free now that they were past all admonitions. They seemed to depend upon it that the air was restored, and that the air was like a man that had had the smallpox, not capable of being infected again. This revived that notion that the infection was all in the air, that there was no such thing as contagion from the sick people to the sound, and so strongly did this whimsy prevail among people that they ran altogether promiscuously, sick and well. Not the Mahometans, who, prepossessed with the principle of predestination, value nothing of contagion, let it be in what it will, could be more obstinate than the people of London. They that were perfectly sound, and came out of the wholesome air, as we call it, into the city, made nothing of going into the same houses and chambers, nay, even into the same beds, with those that had the distemper upon them, and were not recovered. Some indeed paid for their audacious boldness with the price of their lives. An infinite number fell sick, and the physicians had more work than ever, only with this difference that more of their patients recovered. That is to say, they generally recovered, but certainly there were more people infected and fell sick now, when there did not die above 1,000 or 1,200 in a week, than there was when there died 5,000 or 6,000 a week. So entirely negligent were the people at that time in the great and the dangerous case of health and infection, and so ill were they able to take or accept of the advice of those who cautioned them for their good. The people being thus returned, as it were, in general, it was very strange to find that in their inquiring after their friends, some whole families were so entirely swept away that there was no remembrance of them left. Neither was anybody to be found to possess or show any title to that little they had left, for in such cases what was to be found was generally embezzled and purloined, some gone one way, some another. It was said such abandoned effects came to the king as the universal heir, upon which we are told, and I suppose it was in part true, that the king granted all such as deodans to the Lord Mayor and Court of Aldermen of London to be applied to the use of the poor, of whom there were many. For it is to be observed that though the occasions of relief and the objects of distress were very many more in the time of the violence of the plague than now after all was over, yet the distress of the poor was more now a great deal than it was then, because all the sluices of general charity were now shut. People supposed the main occasion to be over, and so stopped their hands, whereas particular objects were still very moving, and the distress of those that were poor was very great indeed. Though the health of the city was now very much restored, yet foreign trade did not begin to stir, neither would foreigners admit our ships into their ports for a great while. As for the Dutch, the misunderstandings between our court and them had broken out into a war the year before, so that our trade that way was wholly interrupted. But Spain and Portugal, Italy and Barbary, as also Hamburg and all the ports in the Baltic, these were all shy of us a great while, and would not restore trade with us for many months. The distemper sweeping away such multitudes, as I have observed, many if not all the out-parishes were obliged to make new burying grounds. Besides that I have mentioned in Bunhill Fields, some of which were continued and remain in use to this day. But others were left off, and which I confess I mention with some reflection, being converted into other uses or built upon afterwards, the dead bodies were disturbed, abused, dug up again, some even before the flesh of them was perished from the bones, and removed like dung or rubbish to other places. Some of those which came within the reach of my observation are as follows. 1. A piece of ground beyond Goswell Street near Mount Hill, being some of the remains of the old lines or fortifications of the city, where abundance were buried promiscuously from the parishes of Aldersgate, Clerkenwell, and even out of the city. This ground, as I take it, was since made a physic garden, and after that has been built upon. 2. A piece of ground just over the Black Ditch, as it was then called, at the end of Holloway Lane in Shoreditch parish. It has since been made a yard for keeping hogs, and for other ordinary uses, but is quite out of use as a burying ground. 3. The upper end of Hand Alley in Bishopsgate Street, which was then a green field, and was taken in particularly for Bishopsgate parish, though many of the carts out of the city brought their dead thither also, particularly out of the parish of St. Allhallows on the Wall. This place I cannot mention without much regret. It was, as I remember, about 2 or 3 years after the plague was ceased, that Sir Robert Clayton came to be possessed of the ground. It was reported, how true I know not, that it fell to the king for want of heirs, all those who had any right to it being carried off by the pestilence, and that Sir Robert Clayton obtained a grant of it from King Charles II. But however he came by it, certain it is the ground was let out to build on, or built upon, by his order. The first house built upon it was a large fair house, still standing, which faces the street or way now called Hand Alley, which, though called an alley, is as wide as a street. The houses in the same row with that house northward are built on the very same ground where the poor people were buried, and the bodies, on opening the ground for the foundations, were dug up, some of them remaining so plain to be seen that the women's skulls were distinguished by their long hair, and of others the flesh was not quite perished, so that the people began to exclaim loudly against it, and some suggested that it might endanger a return of the contagion, after which the bones and bodies, as fast as they came at them, were carried to another part of the same ground and thrown all together into a deep pit dug on purpose, which now is to be known in that it is not built on, but is a passage to another house at the upper end of Rose Alley, just against the door of a meeting-house which has been built there many years since, and the ground is palisaded off from the rest of the passage in a little square. There lie the bones and remains of near 2,000 bodies carried by the dead carts to their grave in that 1 year. 4. Besides this, there was a piece of ground in Moorfields by the going into the street which is now called Old Bethlem, which was enlarged much, though not wholly taken in on the same occasion. Nota bene, the author of this journal lies buried in that very ground, being at his own desire, his sister having been buried there a few years before. 5. Stepney parish, extending itself from the east part of London to the north, even to the very edge of Shoreditch churchyard, had a piece of ground taken in to bury their dead close to the said churchyard, and which for that very reason was left open, and is since, I suppose, taken into the same churchyard. And they had also 2 other burying places in Spitalfields, one where since a chapel or tabernacle has been built for ease to this great parish, and another in Petticoat Lane. There were no less than 5 other grounds made use of for the parish of Stepney at that time, one where now stands the parish church of St. Paul, Shadwell, and the other where now stands the parish church of St. John's at Wapping, both which had not the names of the parishes at that time, but were belonging to Stepney parish. I could name many more, but these coming within my particular knowledge, the circumstance, I thought, made it of use to record them. From the whole, it may be observed that they were obliged in this time of distress to take in new burying grounds in most of the out-parishes, for laying the prodigious numbers of people which died in so short a space of time. But why care was not taken to keep those places separate from all ordinary uses, that so the bodies might rest undisturbed, that I cannot answer for, and must confess I think it was wrong. Who were to blame, I know not. I should have mentioned that the Quakers had at that time also a burying ground set apart to their use, and which they still make use of. And they had also a particular dead cart to fetch their dead from their houses. And the famous Solomon Eagle, who, as I mentioned before, had predicted the plague as a judgment, and ran naked through the streets, telling the people that it was come upon them to punish them for their sins, had his own wife died the very next day of the plague, and was carried, one of the first in the Quakers' dead cart, to their new burying ground. I might have thronged this account with many more remarkable things which were occurred in the time of the infection, and particularly what passed between the Lord Mayor and the court which was then at Oxford, and what directions were from time to time received from the government for their conduct on this critical occasion. But really the court concerned themselves so little, and that little they did was of so small import, that I do not see it of much moment to mention any part of it here, except that of appointing a monthly fast in the city, and the sending the royal charity to the relief of the poor, both which I have mentioned before. Great was the reproach thrown on those physicians who left their patients during the sickness, and now they came to town again, nobody cared to employ them. They were called deserters, and frequently bills were set up upon their doors and written, "Here is a doctor to be let," so that several of those physicians were fain for a while to sit still and look about them, or at least remove their dwellings and set up in new places and among new acquaintance. The like was the case with the clergy, whom the people were indeed very abusive to, writing verses and scandalous reflections upon them, setting upon the church door, "Here is a pulpit to be let," or sometimes "to be sold," which was worse. It was not the least of our misfortunes that with our infection, when it ceased, there did not cease the spirit of strife and contention, slander and reproach, which was really the great troubler of the nation's peace before. It was said to be the remains of the old animosities which had so lately involved us all in blood and disorder. But as the late Act of Indemnity had laid asleep the quarrel itself, so the government had recommended family and personal peace upon all occasions to the whole nation. But it could not be obtained, and particularly after the ceasing of the plague in London, when anyone that had seen the condition which the people had been in, and how they caressed one another at that time, promised to have more charity for the future, and to raise no more reproaches. I say anyone that had seen them then would have thought they would have come together with another spirit at last. But I say it could not be obtained. The quarrel remained. The Church and the Presbyterians were incompatible. As soon as the plague was removed, the dissenting, ousted ministers, who had supplied the pulpits which were deserted by their incumbents, retired. They could expect no other but that they should immediately fall upon them and harass them with their penal laws, accept their preaching while they were sick, and persecute them as soon as they were recovered again. This even we that were of the Church thought was very hard, and could by no means approve of it. But it was the government, and we could say nothing to hinder it. We could only say that it was not our doing, and we could not answer for it. On the other hand, the dissenters, reproaching those ministers of the Church with going away and deserting their charge, abandoning the people in their danger, and when they had most need of comfort and the like, this we could by no means approve, for all men have not the same faith and the same courage, and the Scripture commands us to judge them most favourably and according to charity. The plague is a formidable enemy, and is armed with terrors that every man is not sufficiently fortified to resist or prepared to stand the shock against. It is very certain that a great many of the clergy who were in circumstances to do it withdrew and fled for the safety of their lives. But 'tis true also that a great many of them stayed, and many of them fell in the calamity and in the discharge of their duty. It is true some of the dissenting, turned-out ministers stayed, and their courage is to be commended and highly valued. But these were not abundance. It cannot be said that they all stayed, and that none retired into the country any more than could be said of the church clergy that all went away. Neither did all those that went away go without substituting curates and others in their places, to do the offices needful, and to visit the sick, as far as it was practicable, so that upon the whole an allowance of charity might have been made on both sides, and we should have considered that such a time as this, of 1665, is not to be paralleled in history, and that it is not the stoutest courage that will always support men in such cases. I had not said this, but had rather chosen to record the courage and religious zeal of those of both sides, who did hazard themselves for the service of the poor people in their distress, without remembering that any failed in their duty on either side. But the want of temper among us has made the contrary to this necessary. Some that stayed not only boasting too much of themselves, but reviling those that fled, branding them with cowardice, deserting their flocks, and acting the part of the hireling, and the like. I recommend it to the charity of all good people to look back and reflect duly upon the terrors of the time, and whoever does so will see that it is not an ordinary strength that could support it. It was not like appearing in the head of an army or charging a body of horse in the field, but it was charging death itself on his pale horse. To stay was indeed to die, and it could be esteemed nothing less, especially as things appeared at the latter end of August and the beginning of September, and as there was reason to expect them at that time. But no man expected, and I dare say believed, that the distemper would take so sudden a turn as it did, and fall immediately 2,000 in a week, when there was such a prodigious number of people sick at that time as it was known there was. And then it was that many shifted away that had stayed most of the time before. Besides, if God gave strength to some more than to others, was it to boast of their ability to abide the stroke, and upbraid those that had not the same gift and support? Or ought not they rather to have been humble and thankful if they were rendered more useful than their brethren? I think it ought to be recorded, to the honour of such men, as well clergy as physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, magistrates, and officers of every kind, as also all useful people who ventured their lives in discharge of their duty, as most certainly all such as stayed did to the last degree. And several of all these kinds did not only venture, but lose their lives on that sad occasion. And that's where I'll stop for today. Tomorrow will be the last reading. That goes up there. Yesterday's is there. Thank you for watching. Thank you for everyone who's liked and subscribed and left something in the tip jar. I hope you're all doing tremendously. Bye-bye.